Hello, welcome to the Garrett Ashley Mullet Show. I am, of course, your host, Garrett Ashley Mullet. Today I'd like to talk with you about social injustice and collective guilt trips. What brings this topic to mind is a number of discussions I've had with former friends, not so much friends anymore, but people I used to consider friends, who have bought into the social justice movement hard and completely. And discussions that I've had with them have been incredibly unproductive, unfruitful, and frustrating, to be honest with you. But what I want to figure out is what we should make of social justice. What is it? Where did the idea come from? And is it true? Is it right? Is it helpful? If it is, then we should know that and we should agree with it sooner rather than later. But if it's not, then what are the implications? What is the reason that we should oppose this idea of social justice as it is presented, apiece with the idea of systemic racism and America being an unjust country? Before we get into that much more, I want to talk a little bit about Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. And I've just recently started reading it. One of the accusations that was bandied about by a former high school friend of mine, who's now a social justice warrior, was that I only read books which confirm what I think already, which is not true. And he should have known that that was not true and didn't know that it was true. He just made a claim because he was trying to besmirch my reputation and take me out of the discussion. He was scrambling. He was panicking because I had pressed him on the points that he was making, or the assertions rather, asking for evidence and asking for him to explain what justified his making those broad claims. But I decided to read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States after hearing it referenced, and after hearing Howard Zinn referenced, and after finding it in my suggested readings on Audible. I'm a big reader of histories, particularly American history, but world history in general. And I've read quite a lot of American history on my Audible account. I've listened to quite a lot of audiobooks on American history. And so it wasn't terribly surprising when Howard Zinn's book popped up as a recommended read. What was interesting about seeing Howard Zinn's name in the recommended reading was when I started reading the synopsis, and I'm seeing that this book was hugely influential in academic circles starting in 1980 when it was first published, and on up to the present. Howard Zinn and what he wrote and the kind of history of the United States of America that he gave the world was taught in public schools. It was taught in universities for going on 40 years now. And it shaped a lot of young people's ideas, and a lot of people who are not so young anymore shaped their ideas of the true nature and character of America's founding and of America's history and of America's legacy moving forward. To give you a very brief summary of what I've read so far in Howard Zinn's book, without having finished it just yet, but being about halfway through it right now. It's a 35-hour book, and I'm about halfway through it. The brief summary, the brief version of the book is that you can summarize the story of the United States of America as a tale of oppressors and oppressed. And if you haven't been watching MSNBC or CNN for the past always, the past 5-10 years, then this will come as a shock. But the oppressors in Howard Zinn's tale are straight white males, and the oppressed are everyone else, women and ethnic minorities. Anyone who was not straight white males of European descent, English speaking, is oppressed. The Native Americans are oppressed. The black Africans who are brought over as slaves are oppressed. Everybody is oppressed except for the straight white males who presumably are doing all of the oppressing all of the time. Now, the problem that I see with Howard Zinn's book is where he sets out, by his own admission, to write a different kind of history, because he believes, when he's writing this book and when he's writing his foreword to the book, he believes that all of the histories of America, except for his, show America as the hero, show the founding fathers as the heroes, show our country's legacy as one of virtue and good, upright, moral conduct. But his point in writing a people's history of the United States, as a socialist, I should add, is that history is a tale of the victors. Those who win get to write the histories, and sometimes they're not entirely fair to the people they vanquished, to the people they conquered, to the people that they rule over. So he writes a book, and it is always, in all cases, taking the side of whoever the underdog is against straight white males, against the patriarchy, against the system. So he writes this, and it makes its way through academia, and it creates this impression, because it isn't taught necessarily alongside histories that are going to portray the United States of America in a positive light. It's taught as a substitute for histories that are going to portray the United States of America in a positive light. So what ends up happening, in effect, is that young Americans growing up on Howard Zinn for the past 40 years have been taught to loathe and despise their country. They've been taught to loathe and despise the system. And so when you get to the present, where Black Lives Matter is marching in the streets, they are Marxists. They are self-professed comrades in a utopian scheme to abolish the Western idea of the nuclear family, to be queer affirming, to abolish capitalism, to oppose the idea that children need a mom and a dad in the family, in the home. Black Lives Matter gets to the present, and if they claim that someone who is black was killed because they were black in America, they don't have to support that. They don't have to prove it. They don't have to argue their case. They just get to say it. And because so many Americans went through the public education system and went through the university system and were taught that the story of America is one of oppressor and oppressed, so many young Americans especially, having been taught that and having been born to parents who were taught that, readily believe without needing any convincing. They're primed and ready and biased against America and against the system. And so when a story comes along of a black man who dies at the hands of a cop or at the hands of a white man, they just plug that much that they know into the narrative, into the framework that they've been given through their education, through their indoctrination, through their brainwashing. They plug that much that they know in and are off to the races. They don't need to hear anymore. They don't need to know anymore. Don't talk with them about due process. Don't tell them that the system is going to investigate, this officer is going to investigate the man who did the shooting. Don't tell them that, because they have been conditioned to believe that the system is partial towards white men, towards law enforcement, and against black men. So where do you go with that, right? Where do you have room to discuss whether America is a just and virtuous nation, whether it is salvageable if it has problems, or whether it should be just tossed on the ash heap of history? What room do you have to discuss that honestly with people who have been conditioned to believe that America is the villain? Not just the idea of America, but the system of America, which is an amalgamation of the values and the actions and the statements and the biases, more to the point, of white Americans who make up the majority. How do you have a reasonable conversation with someone who believes that you disagreeing with what they were spoon-fed from little on up about the history of this country? By disagreeing with them, they consider you a racist if you contradict the framework that they've been given. They weren't equipped with critical thinking skills as far as second guessing the framework that they were given. They were just given this framework, and they were told in a million ways by the media, by the celebrities, by pop culture, by their professors, by their teachers, by their textbooks. They were told, accept this or else you are ignorant. Accept this or else you are a bigot. Accept this or else you are on the wrong side of history. So when I, for instance, come to an old high school friend, someone I went to church with, someone I went to youth group with, someone that I considered close, but apparently is no longer so close, when I come to him and I say, you're making claims that America is systemically racist against black people and to the advantage of white people, why? What I get back is there's inequality. And so then I respond with, why do you assume that inequality is explained either in whole or in part by systemic racism? Well, you need to just take my word for it. You need to just start with the assumption that systemic racism is real and then work your way up from there. Okay, well, that's not very satisfying. I disagree with your perspective. I disagree with your claims. I'm not going to accept what it is that you're telling me about this country and about me as a white American who belongs to this country, who's a member of this class that you are a member of also, but which you are condemning as having racism in its DNA. I don't accept what you're telling me, and I'm going to give you an alternative explanation. I'm going to say slavery was once upon a time legal in this country, and then it was not. And that not being legal was 160 years ago. There was a time in this country's history when it was okay for the justice system, for the legal system, to be systemically racist against black people. That time came to an end in the 1950s and 1960s. Since then, it has not been legal to be biased against, exclusionary towards, prejudiced towards, heavy-handed or unjust towards someone based on the color of their skin. So if you're going to say that America in the present is systemically racist, and that's why we see this inequality, where we see income inequality, where we see disparity as far as, rates of fatherlessness in the black community compared with other ethnic groups in America. If you're going to say that fault, the responsibility for that condition or those conditions, those several conditions, or high school graduation rates, or the incarceration rates, all of that is to be laid at the feet of white America, including but not limited to me as a white American. I do not accept that. You have not made your case. You've made a claim, but you haven't supported it with evidence. You just expect me to take your word for it. I don't take your word for it. How's this for an alternative explanation? So that's what I did. I presented an alternative explanation, and I said, what about the responsibility that those within the black community have, particularly individuals, for the culture of the black community? What role do they have to play in this? What share of responsibility do you, as someone who's telling me you believe in systemic racism, what share of the responsibility rightfully belongs to them for the conditions in their communities, for the much higher rates of violent crime, both perpetrators and victims of violent crime being disproportionately black compared with the rest of American society? What share of the responsibility for high school dropout rates does the black community have? If you're going to blame some or all of it on white America, you need to make your case for why it should be some or all of white America's fault. But what share of the responsibility is that of black Americans, individual black Americans, and also the community in general? And so I asked these questions, and I made some assertions which to me seem self-evident. The general idea being that culture influences the values that we personally have. When it comes to Asian society, Thomas Sowell has been really instrumental in pointing out that academics and high test scores and good grades and staying out of trouble and doing well and getting placed in a good career and a good job, doing well at your job, honoring your family by being successful is extremely important in Asian families, in Asian culture. And as such, it's not terribly surprising that Asian families who emigrate here to the United States of America have better average test scores. They have better average college admission rates. They have better average incomes. They have more average household income and wealth. They live within their means. They live below their income. That is a factor of culture, and they are by far leading the pack when you compare Asian Americans versus white Americans. So is that racism for me to say, as a white American who has no vested interest in lifting up, it's not white supremacy on my part to lift up Asian Americans and say, culturally, they have values which they instill in their children, which the parents and the grandparents preach and live by and enforce or reinforce in younger generations. To me, there's nothing at all controversial about saying the values of your family, the values of your community are going to shape the kinds of decisions that you perceive as being advantageous. They're going to shape the decisions that you don't make, because suddenly bad choices will be all the more costly, and you'll perceive their cost more easily and more readily. All of a sudden, good decisions are going to seem all the better because you're going to realize your options are limited. If I do X, Y, or Z, it's going to bring dishonor to my family. If I do A, B, or C, it's going to make my father and mother proud. It's going to make my grandparents proud. It's going to make my aunts and uncles proud. And therefore, I'm going to take this path because in my culture, that is critically important. There's no white supremacy involved in saying that. And yet, what was so frustrating for me is for this person I used to consider a friend to come back and tell me that the arguments that I was making, he would expect to come from some 1960s Southerner. Right? So he was basically implying in a not so subtle way that I am a ignorant racist. I'm an ignorant white supremacist who is saying white America is better than black America. How dare I say that? How dare I blame the victim? And I could go on and say, more about how that conversation went. I don't find it terribly productive. I'd rather you just move on to the next thing. But I do want to stick on this topic of systemic racism, of social justice, and particularly where America is concerned, how long is enough? How much time needs to pass before it is acceptable to move on from slavery, from Jim Crow laws in the South? How long is enough for us to get past the fact that segregation was legal? And honestly, at this point, are we about to go right back into segregationist ideas, only this time with Black Americans saying we want separate hospitals, we want Black doctors and Black nurses to treat Black patients, we want separate graduation ceremonies for our Black students in universities? So you hear about something like that, and you hear about these things where Black Americans are saying, we only want to have Black people involved in these activities. We only want to have Black people able to join the Congressional Black Caucus, for instance. And when a white congressman who has a lot of Black Americans in his district wants to join because he wants to be able to bring the interests of his constituents to this caucus, he's told he can't join because he's a white person. It's Blacks only. Is this revenge? Did you internalize the culture of the South, which came up with Jim Crow laws, and you just didn't realize the extent to which you internalized that? Or is this revenge? Is this you trying to get back at white America, where decades and decades ago, it was imposed on these states and on these cities and on these districts that you are going to permit Black people to have access to all the same services that white people have? You're going to permit them to swim in this pool and drink at this fountain and ride on this bus in this seat. You're going to permit them to have these jobs and live in these neighborhoods. You're going to permit them to go to these schools and work in these businesses. That was all rammed down the throat of unwilling, unhappy Southerners. But it happened. It was done in the interest of equality, in the interest of fairness, in the interest of not holding back Black Americans. How much time has to pass from those days before Black Americans won't be hindered anymore by those things having happened? Well, there's two directions you can go with that question. One is to say, if we are always picking scabs that are trying to heal, if we're always reopening old wounds, if we're always bringing up lynchings and Jim Crow and slavery as if they're happening in the present, if we're always likening things in these very hyperbolic terms happening in the present to those atrocities, then there will never be enough time having passed for us to overcome those past events, to get over it. Now, someone will say, oh my word, did you just say get over it? Yeah, actually. And I say that as someone who has had disappointing things happen in my life. And you can say, well, that is a little bit more than disappointing. Black people were dehumanized in the South. You were not a slave. If you're watching this right now, you were not a slave. Nobody owned you as property. This is a far better place in America today for you to be than just about anywhere else in the world. And the same goes for me. Of all of the countries that I could choose to live in, I would want to live in the United States of America today. Not in 1951, not in 1942, not in 1865. Today. Today is a fantastic time to live in the United States of America, with the exception of the crazy race-baiting leftist hysteria trying to burn down our cities and convince us all that America is this awful, horrible thing. With the exception of that, America's pretty great. With the exception of the left losing its ever-loving mind and trying to destroy America, America's pretty great. Not perfect, pretty great. So at a certain point, you need to get over the fact that your ancestors had hard times. You need to. And I don't mean you forget about it, and I don't mean that it doesn't play any role whatsoever. It has no impact. But it is not okay to constantly be reaching for that, to be reaching for slavery and Jim Crow as an excuse for why you're not succeeding in the present. That's not okay. So long as you do that, you will never succeed and get ahead. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell yourself, I cannot succeed, I can't get ahead, the system is rigged against me. You do that enough and it will become true. It will become true and you will be limited by it. That's not what I want for you. That's the reason why I say at a certain point we need to move past it. And that's the reason why I ask, how much time is needed? How much time needs to pass before it is okay to stop bringing up these things as if they are more relevant to individual interactions between individual real people in the present than the facts of those people's character, those people's actions, what they actually said and actually did? How much time has to pass before it's more important who I am as an individual, who you are as an individual? How much time has to pass before that is the most important thing when there's a conflict, when there's a misunderstanding, when there's a disagreement, when there's a contention, when you're offended, when I'm offended? There's no reason that we should have to wait. How about now? How about now is the time where we say, let's just deal with one another as individuals. I watched this fantastic montage of interviews that Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington and Lil Wayne and others did with people like Don Lemon or Don Lemon. I call him Don Lemon. I think he's trying to sound fancy by pronouncing his name Lemon. But anyway, Don Lemon, that guy interviews and 60 Minutes, Mr. Wallace interviews Morgan Freeman. And the question is all about race, all about, do you feel like racism is keeping Black Americans back today? No, I don't. I think if we would stop talking about racism so much, that it would evaporate, it would go away. If we stopped obsessing over it all the time, it would cease to be an issue. It continues to be such a big issue because you keep making it a big issue. You insist on making it a big issue. And the media does this because the media wants to get your attention. They want to sell advertising, and they need you to tune in order for them to sell advertising at a premium. They want to push this agenda of the left, which is you need Democrats to save you from the boogeyman. You need Democrats to save you from the racists. If America stops being a racist country, then the Democrats lose that tool for manipulating Black voters, for telling them, vote for us or else you're going to be back in chains. Vote for us or else those Jim Crow laws are going to just come racing back. The media being in the bag for progressives, being in the bag for the Democratic Party, being really one and the same, being just a branch of the Democratic Party. They push this idea all the time that Black people are being oppressed, that Black people are experiencing bias and prejudice in America today, just like they were under Jim Crow, just like they were under slavery. And they don't have to actually outright state that, although you'll always find somebody brought on for a panel discussion who's going to make an outrageous claim. And I think that's part of why some of these people get invited on. But you don't get it stated explicitly, you get it implied. You get it created as an impression in the viewer's mind, to where there's nothing for you to refute because it was just implied. It was just presented to you in a series of images and carefully edited speeches and cut sound bites that give you an impression. And then they say this is like this and this is like that, and therefore America is as racist as ever, which is just not true. It's just not true. But I want to get in a little bit deeper to the question of social justice as it pertains to guilt. If guilt is collective, then the social justice warriors have at least the right idea as far as that goes. That is the assertion of social justice, is that guilt and justice are a collective affair, not an individual exercise. If, however, justice and guilt and punishment are all supposed to be individually based on the character of the person in question, on the virtue or vice inherent to the actions of an individual, then social justice is hugely destructive to actual justice. It's a big distraction from actual justice, and it actually perpetrates injustice by lumping people in who might otherwise be completely innocent just because they share certain identifying qualities. Now, let's consider for a moment the possibility that guilt and therefore justice is supposed to be collective. And I remember having watched a sermon given by Tim Keller of the Gospel Coalition here a number of years ago. My cousin Andrea shared it on Facebook, and I watched it and I listened to it, and I went through all of that. And Tim Keller's argument that social justice is biblical justice basically amounted to highlighting the fact that God brings nations to punish nations in the Bible. Israel wanders away, they start worshiping other gods, they stop worshiping Yahweh God, they stop obeying God, they stop being faithful to Him, they start whoring after the gods of the nations around them, they start offering their children as human sacrifices in these pagan religious rituals. And so God gives them over to the nations around them. He allows and stirs up their enemies to come in and conquer them, and that is their punishment. Now, I don't recall if Tim Keller actually uses this as an example, but it comes to my mind. The flood in Noah's day. You have God destroying every living thing on the earth with the exception of Noah and his family and the animals that were brought aboard the ark. Everything else is wiped out. So doesn't that speak to collective guilt? Doesn't that speak to there being a need for social justice in the collective sense? But the answer to that is, at least in part, to be found when we look at individuals in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Another point I want to make here is that it confuses me how treating guilt as collective fits with the admonitions that we have in Matthew 18 from Jesus with regards to when our brother sins against us. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. So here we have Jesus saying If your brother sins against you, go to him privately, make your case, explain what it is that he did that offended you, that was wrong, how it is that he sinned against you, and let him apologize. And in the verses following this immediately, you have Jesus' disciples asking him how many times he should forgive if his brother comes and apologizes. Jesus is asked, shall I forgive my brother 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, 70 times 7. In other words, you keep forgiving your brother if he keeps coming back and apologizing. You don't continue being bitter, no matter how many times he has done that. Now, this is odd to me because as I listen to the arguments about systemic racism and about collective guilt being made by the social justice crowd, I am confused by the examples that are brought up of present-day racism. For instance, you walk into a store as a black man and the store manager starts following you around to make sure you're not going to steal something. Do you know that they were following you? Do you know that they were following you because they thought you were going to steal something? Do you know that they wouldn't have followed you if you were a white man walking in? Is that actually a sin against you? Another example is used often, which is a black man applied for a job, black woman applied for a job. They did not get the job, even though they had as many qualifications, as good a qualifications as anybody else did, and therefore they were discriminated against because they were black. Now, a question in my mind is, how do you know your qualifications were as good as everybody else's? In other words, how do you know that you were every bit as qualified as the person who ended up getting the job? If you're somebody within that company and you were wanting that promotion and somebody else who was underqualified got it, that doesn't have to have anything to do with your race. And I say that as somebody who has been passed over for promotions before due to nepotism, due to this guy goes out for beers with this guy over here, and so therefore this guy over here just ended up getting this specialist gig. I was more qualified. I've been here longer. I've got great performance reviews. I've got the background. I've got the knowledge base. I've got the mentality. I've got the demeanor. I should have gotten the job, but I didn't. And if I were a young black man instead of a young white man, would I assume that I didn't get the job because of my race? If so, is that fair? Is that fair to assume? If it is a question in your mind, according to Matthew 18, the Christian response is not to go and shout that from the rooftops. It's not to go to social media and complain about it. The response should be to go to the person who offended you and ask and make your case and say, I feel strongly that you have sinned against me. Now, that brings us to a whole host of other questions. For one, does it rise to the level of sinning against you if you got passed over for a promotion, if you didn't get a job that you applied for that you really, really wanted? Is that a sin against you? In my case, having not gotten every job that I've ever applied for, having not gotten every promotion that I ever wanted, having seen other people get those that I didn't feel like were as qualified, I didn't feel like they were going to do as good of a job as I would have, I feel like that was unfair. I don't like it. It doesn't make me happy. But does that rise to the level of being a sin against me? In order to rise to the level of being a sin against me, it has to be something which God has said, you don't do that. That's not okay for you to do. Don't do it. Or it has to be that God says, do this thing. You must do this. And if you don't do it, you're sinning. If either of those criteria are met, we're talking about a sin issue. If neither of those criteria are met, then this is not a sin issue. This is you being irritated. This is you being inconvenienced. This is you being frustrated. It is not you being sinned against. But how often, when there is this suspicion of racial bias, racial animus to the decisions that are made in a hiring, firing situation, to the decisions that are being made in a customer service situation, how many times is the person who's offended going to the person they feel has offended them, has insulted them, has sinned against them, to say, what you did really hurt me, and you owe me an apology. Now, if and when that's happening, if the behavior is assumed to be motivated by certain ugly prejudices, namely, they don't like you because you're black. They think ill of you because you're black. They assume the worst about you because you're black. That is something that needs to be established by more than just your suspicion. There should be proof. There should be evidence more than just you not getting what you wanted. But the problem with so much of what I hear used as examples of present day, modern day racism and prejudice and bias is that so much of it is just, I didn't get what I wanted, and I'm a person of color, and I don't like the way they treated me, and so I'm going to assume that it's because of my race. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that that person wasn't just having a bad day? How do you know that they aren't just a jerk to everybody? How do you know that they don't do that to everyone? And even if they did single you out, and they don't do that to everybody, how do you know that they didn't single you out for some other reason besides your race? And even if they did say, you know what, I'm not sure who this person is, I don't know them, they're not from around here, does that rise to the level of a sin for them to have followed you around the store, for them to have not given you what you wanted, for them to have been wary? Is that a sin against you? Now, 50 years ago, 60 years, 70 years ago, if you were going to say, here is a neighborhood somebody wants to buy a house in, and they can't because it is explicitly written into the contracts of this community that this is a whites-only community, and a realtor might lose their real estate license if they sell to a family of color in a whites-only neighborhood. That is no longer legal. That is no longer happening, and if it is illegal, and you can take that to court. You can take that and get a redress for your grievances. But how much of what else we are hearing is people taking something and assuming that it's racism? How much of what we're hearing as modern day instances of racism is the motives were assumed, and the person who is being accused isn't given an opportunity to really explain themselves, or if they are allowed to explain themselves, nothing but, I am so sorry, please forgive me, them getting down on their hands and knees is going to be acceptable? That's an important question that we need to answer. Now, I want you to consider a story from the Gospels, John chapter 9, verses 1 to 3. It says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus replied, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now let's go back again to Joseph, and then we'll jump back to John chapter 9 again. Joseph is a upright young man. Joseph is his father's favorite son. Joseph is the brother that is least favorite because he is his father's favorite. Joseph is sold into slavery only after one of his brothers says, let's not kill him. right? They hated him so much they wanted to murder their own brother. And instead, as a mercy, they decided to sell him into slavery, their own brother. So Joseph ends up going off to Egypt, where he serves in the home of a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar ends up finding him to be so excellent, so trustworthy, so reliable, such a man of integrity, that eventually Joseph is in charge of all of the other servants. He's in charge of Potiphar's house. The problem comes where Potiphar's wife finds Joseph very attractive, and she wants to sleep with him. And she tells Joseph, I want to sleep with you. Please come on, sleep with me. And Joseph repeatedly says, no. My master has given me everything in this house except for you. I am not going to do that to him. No. He ends up in the end being falsely accused of rape because he refuses to sleep with his master's wife. His master flies into a rage and throws him in prison. While Joseph is in prison on a false accusation for which he was not guilty, he meets the Pharaoh's cupbearer and cook. And as he is talking with them, they tell Joseph these dreams that they've had, and Joseph interprets the dreams, and he says, oh, your dream means that in this many days you're going to be brought out of this prison and you're going to be put to death. And in so many days you are going to be brought out of this prison and you're going to be restored to your previous position in Pharaoh's court. And so this happens, and Joseph asks, please don't forget about me. When you are before Pharaoh, please tell him about me. Tell him that I am in here wrongfully accused. I didn't do it. I am not guilty of this. Well, Pharaoh's servant gets released. He gets restored to his previous position and completely forgets about Joseph until Pharaoh has a dream that bothers him, that disturbs him. And so Pharaoh is so upset about this dream, and he's talking about it, and his servant hears and suddenly remembers Joseph. Oh, you know what? When I was in prison, there was a man there who had the ability to interpret dreams. So Joseph gets brought out, and Pharaoh has his dream interpreted. And the interpretation of the dream is that there are going to be 7 years of plenty, where there's going to be an abundant harvest. There's going to be more food than they know what to do with. And after that 7 years, there's going to be 7 years of famine, where there's not going to be enough food for everybody to eat. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of preparing for these 7 years of famine. And the big question in my mind is, if Joseph can be hated by his brothers, can be only narrowly sold into slavery instead of being murdered by his own brothers, if he can resist the temptation to sleep with his master's wife, even though it lands him in prison, if he can go to prison under false accusations and still come out a decent enough man, not broken, not bitter, not wretched, not awful, not cynical, but a decent enough man that he is put in charge of preparing the nation of Egypt for a 7-year famine, then I have a great deal of hope that I can go through adversity, and God is faithful, and God has a purpose for it, and even in suffering, even in difficulty, even in great pain, even in great betrayal, I can be faithful to God, and I can rise above that. I can get through it, because God must have a purpose for permitting this thing to happen to me. And what's remarkable, what's absolutely fantastic about Joseph is that on the other end of this, when he sees his brothers coming to Egypt to get grain for their families, he has the power, he has the position to destroy them completely. If he wants vengeance in that moment, which I'd have a hard time believing he didn't think about, if he wants vengeance in that moment, he can have it. He can destroy those brothers of his that sold him into slavery, that almost murdered him, that told their father he had been killed by wild beasts. And he doesn't. Joseph doesn't do that. That's something that we could stand to learn from. That's something that we could stand to benefit from embracing and internalizing and living according to. That's a good role model for us to look to. But you think about also this blind man that Jesus' disciples ask Jesus about, who sinned, him or his father, that he ended up being born blind. Jesus says, no, nobody sinned. I mean, he's not blind because his parents or him sinned. He and his parents are not the cause of his blindness. This was allowed to happen for God's glory. God has a purpose. God sees the big picture. This is for God's glory and for this guy's ultimate benefit, for other people's ultimate benefit. And so Jesus heals the blind man. He's all of a sudden able to see. He's not handicapped anymore. The point of that being that not all of the suffering, not all of the inequality that we experience, whatever our skin color, is the result of someone else oppressing us. Now, if we ask the question, who sinned, this man or his father, or this black man or this white man over here, or the white system, the black community or the white community, who sinned that this child, this single mother, this young black man has a tough row to hoe, it might just well be that that is the wrong question sometimes. Have we considered that? Or are we falling into the same trap to some extent that Jesus' disciples did when they asked, who sinned, this man or his father, that he was born blind? Now I realize blindness and poverty and living in a crime-infested economic wasteland of a community are two different things. I realize that there's a history of racial injustice in America's history. I challenge you to find a country where there isn't.
It's such a pernicious thing to tell white people that there is nothing good that they actually can do. There's nothing that they're earning because white privilege has set them up for all of that. And so it's not really their achievement. It's not really their accomplishment. There's nothing good that they actually do. They're just totally reprehensible, corrupt, oppressive people because, thank you, Mr. Howard Zinn, thank you, Barack Obama, America has racism in its DNA. Its whole history is a story of oppressors and oppressed. It is such a wicked, evil slander against white people to say all of your accomplishments, all of the things that you enjoy, everything that's good about your life is just white privilege. So you didn't deserve that. You didn't earn that. It really should have gone to somebody else. We're going to talk now very seriously, very earnestly about how to take what you have and redistribute it to everybody else. Because that's really what it boils down to, is when the social justice movement is taken to its roots, and in the current modern day iteration of it, what it means is inequality between Black America and white America is blamed on injustice. It's blamed on systemic racism. It is blamed on white privilege. It is blamed on everything being rigged against Black Americans succeeding and having the same chance at life, the same shot at life. As my former friend from high school just recently told me, whiteness is standing in the way. Romans 13 tells us that the governing authority is there to reward those who do good and to punish the evildoer. Social justice takes that and flips it. Social justice takes that and basically says, no, if the governing authority tries to punish the one who does evil, he's the bad guy. The real villain now is law enforcement. The real villain now is you for saying there is any such thing as wrong, that this guy would be doing it, that he needs to be punished for doing wrong. You're the bad guy. Social justice takes the concept of the governing authority rewarding those who do good. The one who does good is actually the language used. Rewarding the one who does good, and says, no, 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 no. You should not be rewarded. You are a dirty, horrible, awful person, and America is oppressive, and if you have been protected, that's just a symptom of your privilege, unless you're a minority, right? If you're a white person and you're being rewarded, you're being protected, that is just another sign, that's another piece of evidence that the game is rigged and you are oppressing these people. You're taking something that rightfully belongs to them. The problem with all of this is not just that I don't like it. It's not just that I'm saying it's a problem. It's not just that it's inconvenient for me as a white person. The problem for me is, first and foremost, as a Christian, it is antithetical to the justice that we read about in the Bible. It is antithetical to the concepts which are interwoven throughout Old and New Testament with regards to how we're supposed to interact with one another. If your brother sins against you, you go to your brother privately and you make your case. The governing authority is there to reward the one who does good. He's there to punish the one who does evil. He does not bear the sword for nothing. Whoa, what do you mean he's got a sword? He should have only, a sign that says, please stop doing that. I'm going to count to 10 now. No. The governing authority is God's minister to do justice. Micah 6:8 says very clearly, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Doing justice is the Lord's work. It's not all of it. It's not all there is to it, but it is absolutely central to the Lord's work. And to tear down our government because we have law enforcement, because we have laws, because we say this is okay to do and this is not okay to do, that's not all right. To tear down our system of government because once upon a time there were injustices is naive. And it's naive on the part of the people on the ground floor of the movement. And it is woefully dishonest and sinister on the part of those at the top of the movement, because they know, if they have read any history whatsoever, that is just a fact of human existence. It is a fact of human society. It is just a fact of reality. As Dennis Prager puts it, conservatives compare America with reality. And every other nation that's ever existed or exists in the present on Earth. And we conclude America's pretty special, and we should protect it, and we should take care of it, and we should be good stewards of it. It's not perfect, but when you compare it with the alternatives, it's pretty fantastic. It's really not too bad. The left compares America with utopia, particularly Marxist utopia. And so therefore, America will never measure up. It will never be good enough, because we were not founded to be a Marxist utopia. Jesus tells the parable of the talents, wherein 3 servants were each given a different amount of money. They were given different amounts of money. And one of the servants invested it and turned a profit. And another one of the servants invested it and turned a profit. And then one of the servants took the money and he buried it in a field. When the master heard about it, he said, "You wicked servant." And he took the money that had been buried in a field and he gave it to one of the other servants who had actually invested. There's inequality. And if that's a picture of how God is with us, then who are we to say that that is an injustice when God gives differing amounts to different people? We're not all created equal in terms of our abilities. I don't have all of the same physical characteristics of Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, right? If we got in an arm wrestling contest, I don't think I would win. I don't have all of the mental acumen of a Stephen Hawking when it comes to physics. If we get in a debate about physics, pretty sure I'm going to lose that, right? There is all kinds of inequality in the world, and that is just a fact of human existence. And it is not wicked. It is not inherently sinful. It's not inherently evil. We're not supposed to be defrauding one another. We're not supposed to be oppressing one another. We're not supposed to be cheating each other at all. That is evil. But the fact of inequality is not proof that somebody is cheating. If you and I play a game and I win, that doesn't mean that I cheated. If your first instinct is to claim that I cheated because you didn't want to lose, that says more about you than it does about me. And so far as we cultivate a society full of people who cry foul play every time they don't get what they want, we are not going to be a society of winners. We're going to be a society of spoiled sports and of brats, people who say, wah, wah, and I'm not where I want to be because of everybody else. Meanwhile, what are they doing to be all that they can be? What are they doing to get after it? That's true of any skin-colored person in this country. That's true of any ethnic minority person in this country. That's true of male or female. If you're not getting after it, if you're saying it's everybody else's fault that you haven't succeeded, you will not succeed. So long as it's everybody else's fault, that's where you're going to live. And if then you turn around and you blame everybody else for you having just camped out, that's an injustice. That's not fair. That's not right. So, with that, I leave off this video, and I would love to hear your thoughts on social justice, social injustice. If you think I'm totally off base and I'm totally misunderstanding what social justice is or is not, please let me know in the comments. Hit subscribe on my YouTube channel and shoot me a message. If you would rather not say in the comments, feel free to email me at garrettmullet@gmail.com. Look me up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or anywhere else that you can find a social media account with my picture attached to it. In any event, thank you for watching, and I hope this was an encouragement to you and help. God bless, and take care.